At Fort Ridgeline, Private Marcus Johnson endured relentless mockery and grueling tasks, targeted simply because of who he was. Sergeant Blake Turner and Corporal Rick Manning, cruel and prejudiced, reveled in humiliating him at every turn. But Marcus held his composure and revealed a truth that none expected. His father was General Henry Johnson, the commander of the base. Just wait until you see how this revelation turned the tables completely, and how justice was served in a way no one saw coming. Private Marcus Johnson had always dreamed of serving his country. The military, with its rigorous demands and strict discipline, had seemed to him a path of purpose, a chance to prove himself, to test his limits, and to earn respect on his own merit. When he received his assignment to Fort Ridgeline, a well-known base with a storied history and a reputation for excellence, he felt a mix of pride and apprehension. Pride, because he had earned this through years of training, early mornings, and relentless drills. Apprehension, because he knew stepping into a new environment meant navigating unknown hierarchies and personalities. The first morning on the parade ground was sharper than any training exercise he had endured. The sun glinted off the polished boots of the assembled soldiers, the rhythmic clatter of rifles striking the concrete echoing across the open space. Marcus adjusted the strap of his pack, straightened his uniform, and tried to summon calm. Every instinct in him, every lesson drilled into him at the academy, urged him to remain composed. He had faced physical exhaustion, harsh instructors, and grueling tests, but this was different. This was about being seen, about being acknowledged as part of the team, and yet he could feel the invisible weight pressing down. Almost immediately, whispers and muffled chuckles began to circle around him. He felt eyes on his back, on the way he held his posture, on the careful movements of his hands as he positioned himself in line. There was a subtle but unmistakable undertone to it, a mixture of curiosity, disdain, and outright judgment. Marcus had anticipated the challenge of fitting in with a new cohort, but the hostility he sensed seemed sharper, colder. Sergeant Blake Turner, a man known for his strictness and a certain pride in his own rank, stepped forward with Corporal Rick Manning trailing behind. Both were seasoned soldiers, their years of experience making them influential in the base's unofficial social structure. Yet Marcus quickly noticed something else, a deep-seated prejudice that lingered in their expressions, in the way their eyes narrowed, in the smirk that danced across Turner's face as he scanned the newcomers. "Looks like the base finally got its token," Turner said, his tone dripping with derision. The words, casual to him, struck Marcus like a jolt. He felt the heat rise to his face, a sudden flush that he could not suppress. His hands tightened at his sides, fists curling instinctively. Every nerve in his body screamed a desire to respond, to defend himself against this humiliating remark. He could feel the sting of unfairness, the way his stomach knotted in frustration and disbelief. But Marcus held his tongue. He had learned, through discipline and necessity, that reacting impulsively could make matters worse, especially in a place where hierarchy and order ruled. Yet the injustice cut deep. All his achievements, all his years of preparation, seemed to vanish under the weight of their ridicule. It was not the physical tasks of training that hurt. It was the public belittlement, the sense that his identity was being dismissed and mocked. The whispers grew louder. Other soldiers, some curious, some indifferent, some quietly amused, began to glance his way. The tension was palpable, and Marcus felt the cold press of isolation settle over him. He understood the social dynamics immediately. Turner and Manning were asserting dominance, testing him, and aiming to see how far they could push before he cracked. Every instinct warned him that giving in to anger openly could be dangerous, could provide them exactly the reaction they sought. Still, inside him, a fire was kindling. The humiliation, the unfairness, the sting of being singled out, not for his abilities, but for something beyond his control. It all fed a growing resolve. Marcus took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing himself to center his thoughts. He refused to allow this moment to define him. The anger burned beneath the surface, sharp and bitter, yet it became a source of strength. He reminded himself of why he was here, not to please anyone, not to conform to prejudice, but to serve with integrity, to uphold his own standards, and to prove in time that respect could not be demanded through mockery. It had to be earned through character. As the morning drills continued, Marcus maintained his focus, walking with precision, responding to orders with care, and keeping his head high despite the piercing looks and whispered remarks. Deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The anger he felt now would not consume him. It would become a quiet determination, a foundation for what he intended to accomplish. Even as Turner and Manning smirked, unaware of the fire they had sparked, Marcus resolved that he would not only survive this environment, he would rise above it. The first week at Fort Ridgeline had been tense, but Marcus Johnson had managed to maintain a semblance of composure. By the second week, however, the subtle smirks and whispered jabs had escalated into consistent, deliberate humiliation. Every morning, as he reported for duty, Sergeant Blake Turner and Corporal Rick Manning seemed to take greater pleasure in testing his patience. The assignments grew heavier, the drills more exhausting, and the scrutiny sharper. While other soldiers shared routine tasks with minimal strain, Marcus was singled out for labor that left him gasping under the hot sun, lifting crates that seemed almost designed to sap his energy. Each command from Turner or Manning carried a note of mockery, a hidden amusement in watching him struggle. The mockery was not limited to physical tasks. Words, carefully chosen to undermine him, followed Marcus wherever he went. "Careful there, Private Johnson. Wouldn't want to break a nail," Manning sneered one morning, as Marcus scrubbed the polished floors of the officers' quarters. The words were casual, but the intent was unmistakable. With every sarcastic remark, Marcus felt the weight of isolation press heavier upon his chest. He kept moving, kept performing each task with disciplined precision, but inside, frustration and helplessness gnawed at him like a relentless tide. Meals in the mess hall became another stage for the ridicule. He noticed sideways glances, stifled laughter, and the way conversations would hush when he approached. Even soldiers who were neutral seemed hesitant to engage, unsure whether to defend him or stay silent. Marcus felt like an invisible target. He was present, performing his duties impeccably, yet constantly reminded that his presence was unwelcome, that his value was being measured not by skill or dedication, but by shallow judgments. Nights offered no respite. The barracks, usually a place of quiet recovery, felt suffocating. The bunk he shared seemed colder than usual, the space echoing with imagined whispers and judgmental eyes. Sleep was restless, interrupted by flashes of Turner's mocking expressions and Manning's smirks. Marcus tried to remind himself that he was not alone in his struggle, that many soldiers faced challenges, but the venomous edge of prejudice made this different. It wasn't fatigue from training or difficulty of drills that weighed on him. It was the realization that he was being singled out for reasons beyond his control. The emotional toll was compounded by the knowledge that speaking up could backfire. Marcus had considered addressing the harassment, but the chain of command was complicated, and Turner and Manning were respected within the ranks. He understood that accusations could be dismissed, twisted, or even used against him. Each day, as he obeyed orders and endured the sneers, he felt the crushing burden of helplessness deepen. Here he was, a soldier sworn to protect and serve, yet powerless against the cruelty of those sworn to his side. The irony was bitter and relentless, and it fueled a quiet anger that simmered beneath the surface. By the third week, Marcus's body ached from exhaustion, but it was the emotional strain that truly threatened to break him. Each insult, each dismissive comment, cut more deeply than any physical exertion. He began to question how long he could endure, how long he could maintain the disciplined exterior while the inner turmoil grew. Yet even in these moments of despair, there was a small spark of defiance. Marcus had not reached this point in his life, to be reduced to a target of ridicule. He knew that strength was measured not only in physical ability, but in patience, resilience, and the capacity to endure without losing integrity. The barracks, though lonely and heavy with unspoken tension, became a place of reflection. Marcus would lie awake, running through drills in his mind, planning the tasks of the following day, and rehearsing ways to maintain his dignity. Each moment of suffering sharpened his resolve. Turner and Manning might think they had him cornered, but Marcus understood that enduring the pain, holding his head high, and refusing to let their mockery define him was the first step toward a greater victory. In the quiet of the night, as the base lights dimmed and the distant echo of footsteps faded, Marcus's mind hardened with determination. The weight of humiliation was real, the struggle draining, but the fire inside him, fueled by injustice and quiet endurance, began to grow. He would not let prejudice define his path. He would find a way to turn this pain into strength. The morning sun rose over Fort Ridgeline with a sharp clarity that seemed almost symbolic to Private Marcus Johnson. After weeks of relentless tasks, whispered ridicule, and the gnawing ache of isolation, he had learned to navigate each day with a careful balance of discipline and quiet endurance. Yet something in him had begun to shift. The anger that had once flared at every insult had been tempered by patience. The pain that had weighed on him night after night had honed his focus. Today, he sensed that an opportunity was approaching, an opening to alter the course of events, to turn endurance into action. The soldiers assembled on the parade ground, the familiar clatter of boots and the crisp commands of drill sergeants filling the air. Marcus's eyes scanned the lines, noting faces he knew, noting the subtle hierarchy that determined how power and influence moved through the ranks. It was during this routine assembly that he noticed a detail that sparked his mind. Several soldiers, in passing remarks or offhand comments, had mentioned the base commander, General Henry Johnson. To them, it was merely the name of the man in charge, a distant authority figure whose presence rarely touched their daily routines. But Marcus knew the truth. This was his father. A wave of clarity and resolve surged through him. The realization that he held a hidden leverage, a connection none of the other soldiers had considered, was invigorating. For the first time in weeks, he felt hope in a tangible, actionable form. He did not act out of spite, but from a measured understanding that the situation demanded dignity and precision. He would not allow anger to dictate his steps. He would move deliberately, with authority and calm. Marcus stepped forward slightly, raising his hand to request permission to speak. The assembly paused, and all eyes turned toward him. Sergeant Turner, standing with his usual smirk, seemed momentarily unsettled, though he quickly masked it with a casual nod. Marcus inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the moment, and then exhaled with controlled confidence. The murmur of curiosity rippled through the ranks. When he spoke, his voice was steady, carrying a quiet authority that demanded attention. "I am Marcus Johnson," he began. The words seemed simple, yet deliberate, carefully chosen. "My father is General Henry Johnson, the commander of this base." For a brief moment, the air itself seemed to hesitate. Laughter that had once filled the space with scorn froze mid-air. Turner's smirk faltered, and Manning's usual ease vanished, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. Whispers spread like wildfire across the parade ground, a collective murmur of surprise and sudden awareness. Soldiers exchanged glances, some with astonishment, others with a newfound respect. The hierarchy of mockery had been disrupted. Marcus felt the first rush of hope in weeks, a lightness he had not experienced since the first days of training. This revelation was not a threat. It was a restoration of balance. He had not shouted, had not demanded obedience, had not let anger dictate his behavior. Instead, he had used patience, strategy, and timing to assert his presence and reclaim his dignity. The subtle shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. Where once there had been ridicule and whispers of contempt, now there was attention, caution, and curiosity. Marcus could see it in Turner's tight jaw, in Manning's hesitant stance, in the careful avoidance of eye contact by those who had laughed at him. The scales had begun to tip. Hope surged through Marcus, not merely as relief from past humiliation, but as the spark of possibility. He understood that this moment marked the start of a transformation, not just in how others perceived him, but in how he perceived himself. The weeks of pain and endurance had prepared him for this opportunity. The laughter and scorn had sharpened his resolve, and now, with measured calm and a revelation of truth, he held the power to reclaim respect and restore fairness. As the assembly continued, Marcus stood tall, shoulders squared, heart steady. The weight of ridicule had begun to lift, replaced by the exhilarating certainty that the long weeks of struggle had not been in vain. Today, hope had become tangible, a force he could wield with integrity, and the first step toward justice had finally arrived. The announcement had been brief but unmistakable. Sergeant Blake Turner and Corporal Rick Manning were to report to the office of General Henry Johnson immediately. Marcus Johnson stood silently on the parade ground, his posture rigid, yet his mind calm and focused. The long weeks of ridicule, the exhausting physical labor, and the quiet weight of humiliation had all built toward this moment. For the first time, he felt a sense of resolution, a spark of certainty that justice would be restored. As Turner and Manning entered the general's office, their confident swagger had evaporated. The air of arrogance they had carried for weeks now seemed fragile, almost brittle. Marcus observed from a distance as their eyes flicked toward his father, the stern figure of authority that had governed Fort Ridgeline with experience, discipline, and fairness. Turner's usual smirk was replaced by a tense, tight-lipped expression, and Manning's posture, once so casual and dominating, now conveyed unease. For the first time, they were no longer in control. Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction as he watched the scene unfold. Turner and Manning began to speak, but their words faltered under the weight of expectation. Apologies tumbled awkwardly from their mouths, sounding hollow, hesitant, and yet undeniable. Every excuse, every hesitation was met with the measured gaze of General Johnson, whose presence left no room for manipulation or false bravado. Orders followed immediately: corrective training to reinforce discipline, formal reprimands to record the severity of their behavior, and a mandatory sensitivity program to address the prejudice that had caused harm. The consequences were clear, firm, and just. The moment marked a turning point for Marcus. The sense of injustice that had shadowed him for weeks finally lifted, replaced by the quiet pride of vindication. The parade ground, once a place where he had felt targeted and isolated, now reflected a shift in perception. Soldiers who had previously whispered, laughed, or looked away now observed him with newfound respect. Some offered nods of acknowledgement, subtle but sincere, recognizing his resilience and the dignity with which he had faced adversity. The environment around him seemed to change, not because he had demanded it, but because truth and integrity had asserted themselves. As the day progressed, Marcus felt the tension drain from his shoulders. The tasks of training and duty continued, yet they were lighter now, infused with a sense of fairness and balance. He no longer carried the weight of ridicule or the fear of unjust treatment. Instead, he carried the quiet satisfaction of having endured, having waited for the right moment, and having acted with patience and courage. It was a victory that transcended physical accomplishment. It was moral, principled, and lasting. That evening, Marcus stood at attention on the parade ground, the sun lowering over Fort Ridgeline, casting long, golden shadows across the polished concrete. The warmth of the fading light seemed to mirror the inner peace he felt, the culmination of weeks of struggle and endurance. He reflected on the lessons learned. Strength was not solely measured in physical prowess, speed, or endurance. True strength lay in patience, in the ability to endure hardship with integrity, and in the courage to act at the precise moment that justice could be restored. The sight of soldiers moving past him, their expressions now respectful, reinforced this understanding. Marcus recognized that his personal victory had become something larger than himself. It was a demonstration that cruelty and prejudice, no matter how persistent, could be challenged and overcome through resilience, intelligence, and moral courage. His experience served as a beacon, not just for himself, but for anyone facing unfairness or ridicule. The lesson was clear. Integrity, patience, and steadfastness could prevail, even in the most hostile environments. As Marcus lowered his gaze, adjusted his posture, and prepared for the evening dismissal, he understood that his journey had transformed him. The trials, the mockery, and the pain had not weakened him. They had strengthened him. Standing tall in the fading light, he carried more than pride. He carried hope, inspiration, and the undeniable truth that no act of cruelty, no amount of prejudice, could overshadow character, patience, or integrity. The triumph was complete, and the inspiration it radiated would linger far beyond the walls of Fort Ridgeline.